A very good morning to everyone. Here we are once again sharing this search for the recovery of ancestral knowledge, a knowledge that has been passed down from generation to generation and that is still present in many corners of the world despite the whirlwind brought about by the invasion of the Western world. Even despite all the historical processes, we continue to witness institutions, moments, places, and spaces where there are still traces of a manifestation of another way of relating to life, one that has another type of connection with everything around us. Once again, I remind you what we mean by the whole. The whole is the possibility of relating to everything we see materially and to everything we don't see. That is the stars, the mountains, the water, the ancestors. It's the possibility of conceiving life in all its manifestations, and this includes death. So, as we also discussed in previous chapters, within this process or this way of conceiving existence, there is a principle that is fundamental, which is duality. We have already spoken before about what duality is, and it's interesting now that we have here with us Richard Lunnis, who is an archaeologist who has worked for a very long time in Ecuador. He will briefly introduce himself, and he has discovered how this principle of duality and how this relationship to the whole is also manifested in very concrete archaeological processes, as he has discovered it in Salango. So welcome, Richard. Thank you very much for being here. Please tell us first a little bit about who you are and what your work has been.
You might ask, who exactly am I? Well, to answer that, I've spent my time ever since the year 1982, mainly studying Salango in great detail, on the land itself, at the site itself, or through the study of the historical record and the ancient artifacts. I arrived in Salango all those years ago, not knowing exactly what I might find, but it was evidently a site that already had an importance for having been recognized in the chronicles as one of the 4 towns of the lordship of Salangome, exactly from where the Manteña raft had come, which was originally discovered by Pizarro's own ship, just off the coast of Punta Calera, back in the year 1526. And so Salango takes its rightful place in the rich and storied history of Ecuador before the conquest. That is to say, that site, Salango, has a long history, which we now know is a history of 6,000 years, based on scientific discoveries that were conducted 10 years ago, one day, with recent archaeological excavations. So, given that it has such a long and rich history, many people frequently ask me then exactly what Salango is, and it's almost completely impossible to answer that question, because Salango really encapsulates everything, not only because of the length of its history, not only because of its position, not only because of the sequences of cultures that are there, but what was perhaps its purpose, spiritual, during much of that time. So, that is what is relevant for the ongoing discourse of La Ceiba. And for me, it has been a process. We're starting out our entire process with a more, let's say, highly rigorous and scientifically objective piece of work, where it is absolutely, fundamentally, and critically necessary for recording in a rigorous manner the evidence as it comes out of the ground. I'm going to do an analysis. Well, so rigorous in any place where it is feasible to restructure the elements, remove from the ground to make a reconstruction of the formation of the site through time, that then allows us to observe what the patterns recurrences are, what the relationships are between different elements that arises based on the reconstruction of the essential fundamental elements that has been an exceptionally long and very gradual process, Then so throughout those many years and several decades, and over time, it became steadily and increasingly clear and evident that the fundamental purpose is of the site throughout at least the 6th and the 7th centuries before the birth of Christ until the 6th century after Christ, when it was originally built as a grand sanctuary with various sacred structures, platforms, and residential houses, plazas or floors, meticulously designed and constructed specifically as stages for sacred and traditional ceremonial rituals of individuals and of much larger communal gatherings of people, which is its fundamental and most essential spiritual function. And it was meticulously designed and constructed to serve as what we might call a portal to the vast and mystical realm of the spirits, whose local manifestation was the Salango point behind the archaeological site. So the point behind the built sanctuary in Salango Island, they were two elements of a local totality that was an expression of the world of the spirits, which is the world of everyone before, or at least before modernity. Well, we didn't really worry so much about the landscape symbolism back then. It was about recovering the evidence. But over the years, it has become more and more necessary to conceive what is the setting of the built environment, why this specific spot, what relevance, how does that connect naturally with the local and coastal landscape? So that is to say that we are seeing that the profound connection and direct access to the spirit world are also deeply intertwined with the sacred and ancient landscape. And so then it remains a very distinct possibility that there are connections between different sacred sites. Each specific site had its own distinct spirit and manifestation, and each site would have had its own rites. But none of them, perhaps, was sufficient in itself, because they were living in a landscape that was broader, not just Salango, Isla de la Plata, also Picoasa Hill, and others that are still unknown because there hasn't been proper research. So there is this idea that Salango is a small site. At most, in its formative development, it had the archaeological site as such, or the area. The official boundaries of the formal sanctuary occupy an area of no more than 3 small hectares, yet it is widely recognized that this specific site, in a very particular and deeply significant sense, encapsulated the beautiful surrounding landscape. In the vast infinite cosmos, stretching far beyond the landscape, both the vast terrestrial world, the deep marine, and the infinite celestial realms. Deeply spiritual, which is Cosmos Salango, was constructed and established, it seems to me, as a meaningful way to successfully establish and maintain a connection at that specific location. Valid, generous with the cosmos, with the spirit world. So Salango was built in a certain sense.
Acting as a cosmos, which is to say, reproducing a...
Yes, exactly, every time, because as a cosmos, it's always flowing in constant change, and Salango also had to change and adjust itself. So you see a series of structures and reconstructions of the sanctuary throughout the centuries, constantly updating itself according to the new consciousness that arises in response to the new conditions of cosmic consciousness.
Richard, you see, you've been discovering how in each of those levels, constructions or manifestations have been made, let's say, of this cosmic relationship, right? That's what the evidence has told you. Isn't that right? Let's talk about the methodology now, how you, from all those findings that you've had, material ones from your archaeological experience, have managed to understand that this responded to a spiritual institutionality?
Well, to be perfectly honest, institutionality is not exactly the specific word that I would ever apply to this situation. It is more like you really have to see for yourself exactly how I have worked back then to understand it. So it is quite complicated. The original idea is that, look, we don't have here anything to compare Salango to so directly. No, I can't turn to other sites to see, oh yes, it's like Salango is this, yes, yes, yes. No, it wasn't like that. Because Salango responded to different conditions, which are from the Ecuadorian coast, which aren't the same as northern Peru or Mexico, where there has been more research, and they are the most famous sites. Better studied, providing the models for analysis of what the sanctuary temple is. Of course, Salango shares elements with them of construction principles or principles of organization, complex alignments, and even various substances and ancient artifacts. But the ancient archaeological site of Salango is not from the vast Peruvian desert, and it's certainly not from the faraway coastal Gulf of Mexico either. Of Mexico or America, it's not from the Amazon. It's part of a tropical dry forest system that, as a result of the confluence of the Humboldt Current with the Panama Countercurrent, it's a zone then of convergence with alternations, different seasonal ones depending on the sea current, with cold air, with warmer air. So there's rain, there's mist, there's dry forest, wet forest. There is quite a change in fishing depending on the season of the year. Directly or indirectly with different territories, with different worldviews. That is all around the area. But within the site itself, we found a series of evidence that has been unparalleled on the Ecuadorian coast, at least. So first, the idea is that not to impose on the study or interpretation of Salango models based on, or paradigms based on other areas. We have to look at the website's own specific structure. So no, I had no specific manual or guide on how to rebuild the history of the sanctuary, but very slowly, piece by piece, gathering evidence from here, from the back, and with all the various different parts, we began to rebuild. An approximation of the entire site, first during the centuries, 600 BC until 300 something BC. I was after piecing the evidence together, and then looking at the first thing. What was the first real breakthrough moment? It was when I managed to identify more or less what the complete form of the first shamanic house was like, which is a house from the Ngoroi period or phase, more or less. 600, maybe 700 BC. And it's a rectangular house oriented to the northeast. And it has a very distinct central axis because there are 5 precisely arranged rows of sturdy wooden posts that serve to support the heavy weight of the entire roof structure. And this central edge, the central axis that passes through the entrance toward the northeast, and that comes from the south-southwest, I simply saw it as a line connecting things together. The house and its substance with the movement of the sun. Because the sun at the solstice, the June solstice, rises in the northeast, and at the December solstice, it sets in the southwest. So, with that line of the sun's movement throughout the year, the house itself is aligned. So everything that happens in the house is aligned with the celestial movement of the sun. Second, then,
What year does this date from?
I'm very sorry, that is about 600 years, just shortly before the time of Christ, yes. So I happened to see that specific line, and it's like that provided an explanation. And from that came the interpretation of everything else. That specific thing first, then the line. But what exactly had really captured my full attention to concentrate specifically on that line? The circular post holes of the support posts at the back of that ceremonial house. Each one had objects embedded in the bottoms. And then there are the two small circular holes located towards the very back section of the central axis. Each one had a shell. So it was truly wonderful to find right there in the shell in front a beautiful large conch shell, a vasum caestus, which is a small conch that isn't typical of everywhere, because it's not a shell that travels much. The most famous is Strombus. But we found that towards the northeast and in the hole to the south, in the west, after conducting an incredibly thorough and exhaustive search through every single piece of available data and all our resources, we finally managed to uncover the specific information that we had been searching for so diligently all along. And it is truly fundamental, according to Indian cosmology and ontology.
Why, Richard? Why does it represent duality?
Well, you see, that is simply because the very first origin of all this is, but with your interpretation, but it's that for the first time it was really observed so clearly in Chavin, which is a temple from the first millennium before Christ in the Andes of Peru. The Great Temple, well, that specific topic has been investigated by many different researchers for over 100 years now, where there is iconography engraved in stones of different forms, sculptures, ancient stone stelae, where what is recurrent is the constant presence of a large conch shell and a beautiful Strombus sea snail. And there is a highly detailed and intricate depiction of a deity or supreme spirit who is clearly seen holding firmly in his right hand a conch. Specifically, it's a Strombus. He is holding in his left hand a precious spondylus seashell. Well, the right-hand side is masculine, while the left-hand side is feminine. And that beautifully harmonious conjunction then of two shells symbolizing to the right, to the left, masculine and feminine. That's very simple, the explanation, but it's what lies at the core. Then there's a stone, the Tello obelisk, where there is present a great caiman, a dual caiman, or two caimans, of sky, of water, depending on the interpretation. One symbolized with the conch, the other by spondylus. Consequently, the presence of those shells in that site, that context, is particularly striking because Chavin is situated high on the slope Atlantic side of the Andes of Peru. It is located quite far from the coast, and furthermore, those conchs, those shells are simply not found in the waters of Peru, but from Ecuador. And so then, evidently, for some reasons, they became central to the vision, cosmological and cosmogonic, once again, of the religious, and the deeply spiritual currents of Peru, as seen in Ecuador. What we discover in the site of Real Alto, which is a village, Valdivia, on the Santa Elena Peninsula, which was discovered by Jorge Marcos who excavated in the 70s. Perhaps the first village agricultural in the Americas. At the very bottom of a long and ancient stone ramp that slowly leads all the way up to a modest and compact elevated ceremonial platform. A spondylus shell and a strombus shell were discovered in 2 stages. Well, in various other regions as well, in the north of Peru also, as in Salango Jerry Moore discovered the remains of a modest architectural structure, formative with also placed in the ground at a certain distance. This remarkable collection prominently features a majestic conch shell alongside a vibrant and spiny spondylus bivalve, both of which were highly prized as sacred symbols and extremely valuable trade items across many ancient coastal civilizations in the Andean region, representing both wealth and spiritual power. In the layout of the house, in its spiritual principle, not just the movement of the sun and that directionality, but also the concept of the masculine, the feminine, as embedded in 2 shells that come from the Salango tables. So you see in the house, what is the sea? The land where the house sits and the sky, the 3 dimensions are there. And also what is underground, because that's where they place offerings. It includes not just the shells, but also a wide variety of other materials and artifacts. So it's the first time that this became entirely possible to achieve. To see in what way they were seeking to incorporate all dimensions of the cosmos in a space formalized like this to perform rituals. Then there's a ceremonial fire in the center of the house. And then there are other things too. But that line with the presence of the 2 shells that are emblematic of Andean ritual up to the Incas. That was what was impactful for me,